So what you're about to see here is the second part of our conversation with Jonathan Pageau about the symbolism of Dirt Poor Robins. And more specifically in this episode, he starts to break down the themes that appear on our new EP, Dead Horse Alaska Onyx. Kate and I were really just holding back our astonishment this whole time as he was able to dig deeper into the story than we could have imagined just by a symbolic analysis of its structures and themes. So I really hope you get as much out of this as we did. It was a blast for us. And so without any further ado, let's begin.
After all, this is who we are. Made of dirt and fed by stars. In a blink of an eye, we'll be undermined. When they bury our graves in the sands of time.
All right, today we're doing part 2 of our conversation with Jonathan Pageau. He's dealing with the symbolism that we use in Dirt Poor Robins. He's telling us what we're doing and why we're doing it, and he's been far too insightful so far. It's kind of like borderline creepy. But Jonathan is going to dig into some of the subject matter on our new EP, Dead Horse Alaska Onyx. And he has his own YouTube channel where he dives into this same kind of symbolism in other films and other classic stories. Definitely check it out. Going to be a link.
Symbolism of everything.
Of everything. He just explains the entire universe to you, and you get smarter. So check out a link for that in the description of this video. And today we're going to move on. We're going to dig into Dead Horse Alaska Onyx. Okay. So Jonathan, these EPs are part of a bigger story. Although I don't feel like there's enough context where people can really put the whole story together on their own, I've wanted to leave this one sort of as a mystery in the backdrop for this. And so while I was doing that and while I was working on the story, I felt like a ton of this has to do with the world we're in right now, like sadly. And it was written years earlier, most of it. And it was just so weird when 2020 came around where we're talking about plagues and staying home and staying safe in the story. And we're talking about the idea of people wanting to put themselves in a cage for safety. And we're talking and AI's emergence and its role in that. And it's a problem. So so anyway, it's just so weird we're doing that. But I sent you the record, right, of what Kate and I put together here. And I sent you lyrics. And so I asked of you just to, hey, what's sticking out to you? What do you want to talk about? What do you think is important to talk about?
So there's some really fascinating things that are going on in the sense that even in the different songs, like if you show the different songs together, there is this idea of, when I talked about in our last video, I talked about the problem of the heaven and earth separating, right? The problem of patterns and reality separating at the edge of the world or at the end of something. When you die, your identity is no longer connected to your body. So your body decomposes and it's gone, right? And so the matter kind of falls down and the identity goes up in the sense that it's no longer incarnated, okay? So you see some interesting stuff in there in terms of the story Stronger. And in that song, you have a sense of the lower part, right? This kind of monster that's there, that's this sense of this monster that's the accumulation of things.
I didn't mean to be this kind of creature. The brain, the heart, the color, all the features trapped inside and tied down, bound by my own bones. A cell of stone, just 'cause I need to.
We talked about the brain, the heart, the color of the features, trapped inside and tied down, bound by my own bones, a cell of stone. This idea of something which is too much body, right? That is too much body, and so and isn't able to kind of rise up and to fully, let's say, manifest your will. An example of that in terms of your experience is when you do something that you don't want to do, right? Everybody has that experience. You call it sinning, where you have a desire and it's pulling you and you're like, I don't want to do that, but then you end up doing it anyways. That's related to the problem of the too much body, where your desires are pulling you in all these different directions, pulling you apart, really.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so you touched on a couple of themes. One I want you to just dig into a little more. That's the pattern of Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster, more specifically, not the... And so in this, I mean, we kind of have a bride of Frankenstein because it's a girl who lives in Dead Horse, Alaska, who's surrounded by like almost entirely men, right? And so she's kind of like this bride of Frankenstein where she feels like she needs to represent what a girl is to everyone, and then also doesn't have an example to follow of what that would look like if it were done properly. And so in that song, she starts to see everything as a mob coming for her with torches because she can't find a way forward, and she doesn't understand how to exist in this world. So talk about Frankenstein.
Well, you can understand the symbolism of Frankenstein has to do with the problem that we've been talking about since the beginning. That's the problem of how things exist. That's really what Frankenstein is about. And so so everything in the world is made of parts, right? Everything, your body, your chair, whatever it is that you have is made of parts. And the question is, how is it that those parts are also one? And so Frankenstein is all about the problem of the difference between a heap of things and an actual being. And so what Frankenstein does is he's gathering parts. He gathers all these dead parts. And he's like, okay, I've got all these dead parts together. So how do I make this into a being? How does it actually become something alive? You know, and the struggle of doing it and doing it improperly so that it ends up being a monster. And so in the story that you're talking about, you could see it a little bit that way, where this lady who's in the edge of the world and feels the call, let's say, to pull together all these aspects of femininity or all these aspects of her being, and she's struggling to bring it together and to do it in a way that is, let's say, has enough force to be a being, right? Because one of the things that happens with the feminine, especially, is because the feminine tends to represent kind of potentiality or the womb, you know, this idea of the place of where life comes forth, is that there's also the desire to project into it. You know, you can see that happening. You can see it happening in terms of events, right? So you have events in the world happening, and then you have the political parties right away trying to make a narrative out of it, because they're like, I want it to be this, I want it to be that. And they're trying to pull all these events together into a coherent thing. But that's the problem of everything, right? And it's a problem of something that we also experience in our own existence. We have all these parts of us. The question is, how do we pull them together? How do we pull them together so that we're a coherent being? But also, how do we pull them together facing all the expectations of the world around us? Because you always have people trying to make you into something. Mm-hmm. And that can be for good or it can be for ill. Yeah. You could be in a relationship where someone is trying to like impose a frame on you and trying to make you into something, trying to tell you what you want, tell you who you are, all of this stuff. And sometimes it can be good, but sometimes it can be bad as well. But you have to end up doing it internally, where you're actually pulling all these aspects of yourself together so that you have the strength to face the world, basically.
Yeah, again, you're telling our story again without our permission. No. Well, you know, I think this is actually a good transition to some of the other themes because, like, I mean, in modernity right now, I see Frankenstein in the sense that there's all these things that people don't understand where they were connected to before and have taken things and using them detached, you know, like certain principles that are religious principles that are being detached and used without a unifying idea, right? And then there's a really profound thing that happens in the longer story of Frankenstein is that he remembers things, but he doesn't have the memories. Like he remembers how to read and write. Like he doesn't need to be taught that, but he has. And he doesn't have the memory of his life. And I think that's so, like, I feel like we wake up to that all the time because I'll hear someone just give me, like, they'll make a moral argument and they don't understand what a moral argument is anchored to at all. They think it's just anchored to the fact of what everybody should want somehow. And so I feel like we're getting into this modern world where things are disintegrating, like the structures of the city, for example, you're watching that happen right now, they're disintegrating, the unifying principle that keeps people together, and they're disintegrating for two reasons. One, because people don't know what those are, right? Yeah. And then two, when they try to discuss it, they're too fragile to handle the differences in what people are seeing. So you're just seeing this, and our story deals with that, so...
A century and the plague has spread. A suburban hell for the living dead. Locked alone in their lavish homes, with pets and wigs and their bloated thrones.
So I'm concerned about in the future is that there's this explicit and implicit message that, you know, you need to go home, stay home, and stay away from people.
Be safe.
The things are too tough and too rough. And so in our story, yeah, there's viruses and there's plagues and there's just temperamental problems between people that everybody is starting to spread into this like really insipid grid.
Yeah, and it's scary because one of the things, for example, you know, one of the things that ancient communities used to provide, you know, the village, the church, is that you were forced to be in communion with people that were different from you. Right. So if you lived in a small town, in a small village, you had to deal with all these people, and you had all these people that are different ways of thinking, different opinions, different politics, different, ways of raising your children. All of this, you just had to deal with it. So you had to find a way to be in communion, you know, and a church is the ultimate example of that. It's like you go to church and there's someone, there's that jerk there that you can't stand, and there's this person who you don't understand why they're doing that, and it's like, so you have to deal with that. The problem with the situation right now is that because we tend to isolate into our space, and then we go online, and then online what we end up doing is we end up creating networks of people that are far away from each other, but that are very pointed in terms of agreeing with our political opinion, or very pointed in terms of being interested in this very obscure manga that I like, or whatever, right? And so, it's like, and so we end up not having to learn the capacity to be in true communion with others, where we have to face difference and find unity in our difference, you know. Here in Canada, we have Justin Trudeau who always saying diversity is our strength, right? And the idea is that you can't say just that. It has to be unity and diversity. Mm. That's our strength, right? Mm-hmm. It can't just be diversity, because diversity without unity is called decomposition. Mm. It's actually decomposition of a body. So you need both. And the online space and this weird isolation that we've been forced to engage in the past few months is just not making it better. It's not helping.
Well, you're using the word communion, too, and it's a word people don't think about, because communion doesn't mean everybody believes and does the same thing. Community is because of all the specialization for the same purpose. So in the power that provides you of, well, good, I don't have to learn and know and do all these things to survive. I can just be one tool in a tool belt of civilization, right? And work together. But I think that isn't this inevitably happening because we have so much autonomy, in the sense that we couldn't have locked down a few years ago, if you want to just talk about like current events, because we didn't have the delivery services, and we didn't have the online connectivity, and it wouldn't have been an option, right? So now that it's an option, why don't what's going to stop people from just constantly doing this farther and farther and farther away?
Yeah, no, for sure. There's a weird, the weird push towards isolation is very scary. It's scary because it's fragmenting our society, and it's creating parallel patterns, and you don't know your neighbor. You don't. It's insane. It's such an insane reality that we live on suburban streets and we don't know, like our third neighbor from the right. That's crazy, and we don't realize how crazy it is. But it's a madness that is very dangerous to the fabric of our society.
Oh, that's true. I mean, and this is why we made this record.
It tore your heart out. Oh, when you didn't understand why the beat had started. It tore your heart out. Oh, when you didn't understand why you want what you
have this imagery of also this kind of ascent. It's like going up the mountain.
Those who sojourn.
Yes, those who sojourn. So in that one, you really do have the sense now of this like ascent of the being, this being that's too low or something like that, is now going up the mountain and is reaching that point where they can encounter the stars, encounter the heavens. You talk about drinking the clouds, swallowing the stars. So all of that is that relationship between above and below kind of coming together in this. The place where above and below meet is usually represented as a mountaintop. This place where heaven and earth actually meet in our experience.
There's a sense of this where it's related to everything, and because when you're talking about this disconnect between the heavens and the earth and spirit and body, one of the things we also experience far more often is the disconnect between our own mind and our own desires. Our body wants to go one way, we want to go another, and if you don't listen to the messages at the right time, it's death. It's the same thing.
The whole symbolism of addiction is a good way to understand the problem of, let's say, not being able to do what you want, or not being able to, or having a pattern that you want, but then falling into these kind of weird, chaotic patterns that kind of drag you down, is a good image of that problem of not being able to connect heaven and earth.
Drawn up to the mountain top, though the air drew thin, I would not stop. I drank the clouds, I swallowed stars, I grew beyond what we call fire. At last I saw the great divide, but I couldn't reach outside of time until you reached your hand for mine, until I held your breath inside. Maybe those who sojourn will own the land.
Right. And then finally, in the last one is really the last one in terms of, I really like the last one because it does talk a little bit about the question, let's say, of the edge, the question of going to kind of like the end of the world.
Not alone. For us there was no land beyond the edges of our outstretched hands. Can we beggars understand more than our appetite demands? For us there was no land beyond, no land beyond.
But then also kind of interestingly enough, kind of filling it, you're like filling death with life. So you get a sense of that there's no land beyond, like that, you reach the end of land, but then there's also the idea of the kingdom, right? So the kingdom come, that the light can be seen even from the edge. So you have these images coming together. So I love the canons at the end because these I really like them. When you listen to the song, you really have to pay attention to hear them because they're kind of in the background.
Right.
It says, if you don't know why the bell tolls, you'll only hear the chimes. If you don't know the language spoken, you only hear the rhymes. And I love that image. I just find that it's very powerful in terms of this disconnect, right? The disconnect between meaning and, let's say, the manifestation. So if you don't know what, when you ring a bell, usually the idea of the bell that rings for church or to announce something like a funeral or to announce a wedding or you announce something, but when we ring a bell, it usually has to do with a reason. But if you don't know what that reason is, then it's just noise, right? It just ends up being noise. And the same for the image of when you talk about a poem and you hear, if you don't know the language and you only hear the noise, you only hear the sonority. So that really is this breakdown of meaning that happens at the end, the breakdown of death. All of this imagery is related to this breakdown at the edge of the world. But then you end And you say, in the end, we're all madmen, which is such a great image. Just that image is great. In the end, in the sense of, if you talk about the end in the sense of the end of the world or the edge of the world, those two are related in terms of symbolism. That's what happens, right? You move towards madness. You move, and madness is the disconnect. That's what madness is. Madness is the incapacity to make sense. It's the incapacity for things to come together. It's when things break apart. It's when statements don't connect, right? And you say one thing, you say another, they're not connected, or you think they are, but they're not. And so that's what this madness appears as. And then you end with like the greatest, of course, with the greatest of all, which is that when the world is upside down, follow the fool for solid ground. So you have this idea of, it really is in the end an image of resurrection. You have a few images of resurrection in there. There's a lot of images of the breakdown, but then there's an image of resurrection. And that little last sentence is also this image of resurrection, which is that at the end of something, when everything is lost and everything is upside down, there's a final flip that happens, which brings about new life, you know?
Yeah, so like this is an idea that you talk about a lot that I love, and it's the role of the fool, the archetype of the fool in stories, because if you're in proper space, like if you're in the proper space, the fool's the one who ruins it all. He goes out to the edges and starts to see things that he assigns the meaning to those things, and he flips everything out, or he drags things in where they don't belong. But at the same time, in a bad system, it's the fool who fixes it.
Because the fool is there to point out, at first, the fool is there to point out how the world isn't working. Like he points out the exceptions. He points out the things that don't make sense, and he brings them into the world. He's saying, you know, juggling and cartwheels, everything's turning, everything's upside down, wearing like a clown, for example, who wears clothes that are too big, who is a caricature, right? But then when the whole system is falling apart, like when everything is upside down, then the last thing the clown can make fun of is the upside down. Like that's the last thing he can mock, is the fact that now everything is like me, ha ha ha, and then things kind of come back into normalcy.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're the only ones already accounting for the anomalies.
That's right.
That's right.
If you don't know why the bell tolls, you'll only hear the chimes. If you don't know of the language spoken, you'll only hear the rhymes. If you don't know why the bell tolls, you'll only hear the chimes. If you don't know the language spoken, you'll only hear the rhymes. If you don't know why the bell tolls, you'll only hear the chimes.
There's on Ravenlocks, there's a quote of
Our
one of our
previous
lyrics.
record.
The wise man flies, for a clear mind reads the signs of the times. And that was one of my questions to you is, do you think there's a type that sees these patterns, and it or can anyone learn to see more of these things in life, or is there a type?
I have no idea. I don't know. I think that artist types, and I guess you would call them prophet types, I guess, they're able to generate the patterns. They're able to intuit them, right? And so that's why sometimes I would listen. I remember when I was younger, a bit younger, I would hear sometimes, as I was discovering these patterns, I would hear music on the radio of bands that are completely, like let's say the Red Hot Chili Peppers. If you want to understand the edge of the world, like listen to Californication, you will have every image of the edge of the world just like condensed into one song. But if you ask them to analyze it, they'd be like, whatever, I just want to, do whatever they do. They're not necessarily doing it in a rational manner, and that's fine as well. And then there seems to be another type of person that is maybe able to interpret the patterns and to help people kind of see them in a more reasonable way and see that, okay, this is satisfying to you in terms of rhyme, in terms of poem, in terms of story, and I can maybe help you understand why it's doing that and why it's not arbitrary.
You just sit and think, and then you just go to write music, and you're writing about what you're thinking about. And I mean, it's kind of eerie when it's like, oh yeah, like I'm projecting in the story way into the future, and then it's like the next year comes along, and it's like, oh, actually your story came like way more true in 1 year than you thought it would have. So this was great. Jonathan's channel is awesome. He's an incredible iconographer if you're interested in art too. I'll leave links to this kind of stuff in there. And he also has a really great blog.
The blog, we have a real mix of people. Like there are Orthodox Christians, there are Jews, there are atheists, there are Protestants, Catholics, all kinds of people writing about these symbolic patterns in stories and politics and all over the place.
It's been super helpful as an artist to follow you, and really inspirational.
When the world opens back up, we want to come see you too. So you got to show us around.
I'm looking forward to meeting you in person, and I wish you the best for your new EP and the album that'll follow, I imagine.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, go team. Thanks.
I dreamt a beast rose up from the sea.